Commissioner Kemp, can you hear me?
No.
No, you cannot hear me? Okay. We can hear you. Well, we do have audio that we can hear you. That is good.
Okay, you can hear me.
I can hear you, yes, and I believe the meeting can as well.
Yes. Morning, Pat.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you today? Commissioner Starkey, can you hear me?
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm on mute.
Morning.
Oh, no problem. Very good. Good to see you.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Great.
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Chris, are you able to hear me?
Mr. Johnson, yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to mute.
I'm gonna get an extension cord.
All right, it's good to see everybody getting assembled here. Commissioner Long is logging in now. It is about 9:59. Mr. Holton, you may want to wait another minute or two because people seem to be joining here.
And we'll let everyone sign on.
Yeah, we'll give everybody time to do that.
Hi, Jim.
Hey, good morning.
How are you?
Good. I like the official background there.
Yeah, absolutely.
How'd you do that, Janet?
That's a really good question. Who's asking me that?
Catherine.
Oh, hey, Catherine. Our county IT department did it so that we would all, kind of be uniform when we do our commission meetings.
Oh, that
Hey
makes sense.
there.
Hey, I was getting an extension cord. Yesterday on one of my calls, my Tampa Bay Works thing, everything went blank and I didn't realize I had no power.
Well, it was your ceiling that I was looking at when I said, I just saw somebody's ceiling and it was yours. How are you?
I'm good. Did you eat your blueberries?
Oh, I'm making blueberry muffins today.
Nice.
I'll let you know how they turn out.
All right.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we got another 2 weeks and then we're done. We went to the wrong part of the farm, but that's okay.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for letting us know that now. Tell Trey, I'm a little annoyed that he didn't take better care of me.
Well, it's my fault. He said go to the east and someone else said go to the west, so we went to the west.
Okay.
Guys, we have everyone on that's going to be on. Chris?
I do see the mayor, Mayor Casters is getting into position here. May want to give her just another minute. I'm giving a quick look here at anybody who might be an attendee who needs to be a panelist. Jennifer, I don't know on the panelist screen if you see anybody there. If you want to give a quick look at the panelist screen and see if there's anybody who we are expecting. I do know that Commissioner Mitten may be joining us a little later in this meeting. And if I do see him join, I will, at the earliest convenience, acknowledge him to make sure that he's recognized as being a participant in the meeting. But I do not see Commissioner Mitten here yet. And I don't know, Jennifer, if there's anybody else who, when you look at the list, that you want to wait for.
Chris,
Yes.
could you ask Jennifer if she can email to Doyle the sheet that has the agenda for the finance meeting? When I printed out my agenda today, I've got all the backup material for the finance committee meeting, but what I didn't have was the sheet that gives me the agenda, and I don't want to mess up my report.
I think Jennifer,
That's her, Janet. I'll make sure to get that sent out to you today.
Yeah, if you could send it now, I can pull it up on my other iPad and at least be able to reference it for when I give my report.
Okay.
Thank you.
I do know Mayor Kreisman is not with us, and he was a tentative, I believe.
Great.
I believe that, is it Nicole, who is here for District 1 today? Nicole Mills is also joining us as well. And she is online.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Jennifer, would you say we're ready to proceed?
In just a moment after I get this
Okay.
sent over to Ms. Long. Hey, I'm ready if you are ready.
All right, Mr. Holton, you may proceed.
Very good, thank you. I don't have my gavel, so I'll just use my pen and call the meeting to order. Welcome everyone to the April 24th electronic TBARTA board meeting. Appreciate everyone participating today and taking time to do so. A few announcements before Jennifer calls the roll. This meeting is being held pursuant to the Governor's Executive Order 2069, which suspended all quorum requirements for local governments and agencies. TBARTA will in fact vote on this as our first order of business to validate the governor's order. 7 days notice has been posted on our TBARTA website for this. The public is encouraged to participate through the Zoom platform. Proper notice has been given as well. And finally, this meeting is being recorded. I wanted to make everyone aware of that. With that said, Jennifer, please go ahead and call the roll.
Okay. Jim Holton,
Present.
Cliff Manuel,
Present.
Commissioner Janet Long,
Present.
Commissioner John Mitten, Commissioner Pat Kemp,
Here.
Commissioner Reggie Bellamy, Commissioner Catherine Starkey,
I'm present, thank you.
Commissioner Karen Seal,
Here.
Mayor Rick Kreisman, Mayor Jane Castor,
Here.
Morning.
Secretary David Gwynn,
Here.
and I believe Nicole Mills is filling in for Secretary Nandam today, correct, Nicole?
Correct, yes.
Okay, I will mark you here. So we do know Rich McLean will not be attending, and we will have to see if Commissioner Reggie Bellamy and Rich McLean join us later. But we do have a quorum.
Thank you, Jennifer. Why don't you go ahead and give the public service announcements about the procedure for public comment before we call for public comment?
Sure. TBARTA has developed new methods of ensuring public comment during electronic meetings. First, members of the public have been notified that they are allowed to submit written comments to TBARTA prior to all meetings by email to publiccomments@tbarta.com. Comments are limited to 400 words and received at least 30 minutes prior to the start of the meeting, and they will be read into the record during public comment. In addition, members of the public have also been provided the information on how to speak during public comment, up to 3 minutes by calling a conference phone line prior to the start of this meeting. That number is 267-866-0999 with access code 1234351876. All comments submitted for this meeting by Communications Media Technology will be included as part of the public record and will be considered by the TBARTA board prior to taking any action. TBARTA's Cindy Raskin is the public comment administrator for this meeting. She has our conference line open and has also received any written public comment. Cindy, is there anyone who wishes to provide public comment during this meeting?
Thank you. We have nobody on the phone. However, we do have one email comment, which I can read into the record now, if that's acceptable, Chairman.
Yes, it is. Please do so.
Okay, this comment comes from Mauricio Rosas at 118 West Mohawk Avenue in Tampa. And he says, "Dear board members, I'm glad to see everyone doing their best to protect one another by having these meetings via Zoom and YouTube. I also want to thank you for reading our comments into the record and not just putting them into the record. It's a great asset for folks like me who cannot drive and many who are normally at work. I hope this becomes a best practice for the post-stay-at-home rule. That said, I will comment on the TBARTA BRT community input meetings. They were not conducted fairly and accurately. I don't say this lightly as it is a serious allegation. The imagery that was used did not reflect the actual corridor. Imagery from places other than Tampa was used. Our community is being misled and it needs to be rectified. In the past, FDOT has used computerized flyover imagery to give a simulated look at their concepts. I would urge you to take a step back, look at the product, and use imagery of the existing landscape, as well as simulations to conduct a more legitimate and fact-based community input meeting." That ends the written public comment, sir.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wishing to make public comment? Please contact staff. And you've had no further contact with the public?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Then that said, I will close public comment and we'll now turn to the first action item, which is approval of the resolution to adopt the electronic meeting. And I'll recognize Council Alan Zimmett for the presentation for this.
Thank you, Chair. This is a resolution that would adopt the procedures for these virtual meetings to be conducted by the board during the emergency that has been declared by the president and the governor and the counties in which that TBARTA serves. The governor and the counties have issued stay-at-home orders that prohibit us from conducting any kind of assembly that has more than 10 people together, which means that we cannot proceed with and it would not be safe to hold a public meeting with board members, TBARTA staff, and the public being present. The governor issued Executive Order 2069 that suspended all requirements of any statute that require a quorum of the board members to be physically present. That includes the provisions of Chapter 343 that govern TBARTA. The governor's executive order authorized local governments to meet by means of communications media technology as provided by state statute. The resolution intends to conform the procedures of this board meeting and the committee meetings that will be held by TBARTA during the emergency with that state statute. So the resolution does three things. It confirms that the governor's executive order, authorizes the meetings of the board and the committees to be conducted remotely by communications media technology. It provides the procedures for conducting the board meetings and the committee meetings, and it expires when the governor's declared state of emergency is terminated. And with that, we would recommend approval of the resolution.
Thank you, Alan. Any questions for Alan prior to a motion?
Move approval, Mr. Chair.
Second,
There's been
Catherine
a
Starkey.
motion and a second. We know this time, but please everyone identify yourselves for the record so Jennifer can take it down, but we have Janet and.
I'll go ahead and take roll, Chair.
Just let's
We have to have
Jennifer,
one public comment.
Jennifer, one note. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I know that Commissioner Bellamy is trying to get onto the meeting. I have admitted a phone line. I'm not sure if Commissioner Bellamy can hear me, but if he can.
Yes, I can.
Very good. So Commissioner Bellamy is online in attendance.
And I believe Rich McLean, I saw Commissioner Mitten join us as well. Commissioner Mitten, are you there?
Yes, good morning.
Okay, thank you. We're having a hard time hearing you. Oh, good morning.
Welcome.
Okay, so I believe we do need to call for public comment before we go ahead and take a vote on this. Cindy, do we have any public comments?
We do not have public comment on this item.
Okay, I will go ahead and take roll. Jim Holton.
I think you have to have the public comment first before we vote. Someone wishes to make a public comment?
We do not have public comment for this item.
You said you
Sorry.
did. Earlier was a little.
I thought she said we did, so.
I did too.
For a lively public comment.
Apologies.
None being heard. Is there any further discussion? Okay, yes, Jennifer, please proceed with roll call.
Okay, Jim Holton,
Yes.
Cliff Manuel,
Yes.
Commissioner Janet Long,
Yes.
Commissioner John Mitten,
Yes.
Commissioner Pat Kemp,
Yes.
Commissioner Reggie Bellamy,
Yes.
Commissioner Catherine Starkey,
Yes.
Commissioner Karen Seal,
Yes.
Mayor Jane Castor.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes.
Thank you. Motion carries. Next item of business is the consent agenda, which is the prior minutes. Are there any changes or corrections? None being heard, I'll accept the motion to approve the prior minutes.
Move approval.
You have to say your name.
Commissioner Long moves
Cliff
approval.
Thank you.
You'll second.
There's been a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Again, even though this is a fairly perfunctory matter, we have to take roll according to Alan's recommendations here. So that said, Jennifer, please call the roll on the approval of the minutes.
Jim Holton,
Yes?
Cliff Manuel,
Yes.
Commissioner
on.
Janet Long,
Yes.
Commissioner John Mitten,
Yes.
Commissioner Pat Kemp,
Yes.
Commissioner Reggie Bellamy,
Yes.
Commissioner Catherine Starkey,
Yes.
Commissioner Karen Seal,
Yes.
Mayor Jane Castor.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next item is an information item, which is the impact of COVID-19 on transit, and Chair recognizes David Green to brief us on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining our virtual meeting today. I know everybody has their hands full coping with this difficult situation, but I hope you and your loved ones are all well and staying safe. COVID-19 clearly has impacted us in ways we couldn't have imagined just a few months ago. The economy's unrecognizable, and I'm sure we all know people whose jobs are affected and are doing everything they can to stay healthy. The world that we knew has changed, and the transit industry is no different. The two greatest impacts to transit have been in operations and secondly in funding. Operationally, agencies are emphasizing the safety of employees and passengers, and they've adjusted accordingly. Where the industry traditionally focuses on things like increasing frequencies and maximizing the number of vehicles on the road and ridership and fare box return, it's now the complete opposite. Some of the strategies that agencies have adopted are reducing service levels, eliminating fares, implementing rear door boarding and limiting the number of passengers that can ride at a time. And they're even blocking off seats to spread passengers throughout vehicles as much as possible. They're actually encouraging people to not use transit unless absolutely necessary, if you can believe that. They're providing PPE to bus operators, and from a maintenance standpoint, are focused on disinfecting vehicles as much as keeping them in good operating condition. On the funding side, there's lost revenue for those agencies who aren't collecting fares, and there's a great concern about future funding streams from cities, counties, and states that aren't collecting as much revenue as they budgeted. Fortunately, at the federal level, you all know the CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th, providing $25 billion to support the industry. The intended use of that transit industry influx of money was to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19, to cover things such as operating costs to maintain service, lost revenue that I mentioned, purchasing PPE and paying administrative leave for personnel due to reductions in service or having to self-quarantine. But once the program was initiated, the FTA expanded the uses of the funds to include all activities that are normally eligible under the 5307 Urbanized Area Formula Program, including planning, capital, and operating activities. Operating expenses are eligible dating back to January the 20th, and there is no limit on the amount of funds that can be used for operating expenses. Activities are funded at 100% federal share, meaning there's no required state or local match, and there is no lapse date, so those funds will remain available until expended. They don't expire. The COVID-19 situation obviously is going to evolve over the coming weeks and months, but the transit industry's focus, no doubt, will continue to be on the safety of employees and passengers and on sustaining operations. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Janet, you're recognized.
thank you. David, excuse me. That was a great report that you just gave with regard to the stimulus money for transit from the feds, but I do not believe I heard you indicate what the amount of that funding would be coming to TBARTA?
TBARTA's amount is $2.2 million. TBARTA is part of the Tampa UZA, which is made up of 4 organizations: HART, PSTA, PCPT, and TBARTA. And our UZA received a total amount of $91 million, which was split according to the typical split ratio that we use for the 5307 funds that we receive each year. So of that $91 million, TBARTA's share is $2.2 million.
Thank you very much. That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for David on this item?
This is Pat Kemp. I'd just like to say thank you for that update. I do think, though, that in terms of art, that frequency is still an important aspect of what we do, because our buses have been filled on our routes that are some of our big routes. And if you try to limit the frequency of the buses, but you're just trying to have them half full instead of full, by doing that, you really it ends up being very, very difficult. And we've had all kinds of difficulties with that. So I wouldn't necessarily want to give the impression that we want to discontinue frequency, because we found that to be a problem. I think frequency on these big routes is really important if we want to have the buses more open, but still provide critical necessary service, which I'm guessing that St. Petersburg is the same as Tampa, where our ridership hasn't dropped as much as other places across the country, because I think we're already at such a bottom line that the ridership has been important just for essential business services and essential trips.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good point. Does anyone familiar with the rules requiring PPE on the bus systems? Are there any, Pat or Janet or anyone?
No, I'm not aware that there are any specific rules or
Yeah.
guidelines, but I'm happy to find out.
Yeah, I listened to the University of Florida webinar yesterday that IFAS and FAC put out, and if someone is sick and coughing on a bus, then it could get spread around. So might be a good thing to require, actually.
That's a very salient point, I think. And there was an instance up in the Northeast where that in fact happened, I think, with a bus driver that passed away for that. So I would like to hopefully see a report at some point on what PPEs are required in systems that are partners with TBARTA on this. And what about our ride share too, David? You have any information on that? How that's going during the COVID crisis?
Yes, so we are continuing to work with our van pool provider and the number of vans that are in operation. Obviously, all employers are concerned with the CDC guidelines and maintaining safe social distancing requirements. So many of the vans have been reduced to just a single driver in order to get to work. There are obviously essential employees that use vans that need to get to work. So there are many that are still in operation, but at the same time, they have cut back on the number of passengers that are allowed to ride in those vans.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions or comments from members before we move on to the next item?
Yes, this is Pat Kemp. I'd like to just ask a question. David, when you said that it's down to a single rider, so you mean that the van pool program is operating with just a single person and no one else on it?
Yes, that's correct in some circumstances. Some vans have just been discontinued altogether, but there are vans that are being driven with just the driver alone.
And can you give us, hopefully by next time, I would think that it'd be really important to have a report on that drop in ridership, as well as the number of vans, as well as the number of people being taken in a van, because I do think a van situation presents a bigger problem vis-a-vis this than a bus service does.
Absolutely. We are currently working with our van pool provider Enterprise, and we're trying to get updated information about those exact statistics that you're asking about. And we're happy to share that information as soon as we get all of the accurate data.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to add, this is Commissioner Starkey, I wanted to add that the, I don't know if it's a doctor or professor from University of Florida, did say that if you're wearing one of those, even just the cloth mask, and you cough into that cloth mask, that will stop the spread of the particulates. So even if they're wearing that homemade mask on the bus, that'll cover it. Doesn't have to be any fancy PPE.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Janet, please.
thank you very much. It is my understanding that Debbie Leos is on the line participating in our meeting today, and she does have the requirements for the PPE for our bus drivers. If you would like her to give those specifics, she is available to do so.
Yes, please have her do that. I think that's a very important thing to consider as you move forward, and I would encourage all of the transit operators to require, as Mr. Starkey said, some form of mask or scarf or something.
Okay, well,
I think we're talking about, Janet, we're talking about two different things. You're talking about the bus driver, and I'm talking about the bus riders. So
okay, well, one thing at a time, because I have the floor, and Jim, if you could ask Debbie to participate, she'll answer.
Debbie, please give us an update on that, and you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair. Debbie Leas here from PSTA. And while there are no specific requirements for bus operators, both APTA, FTA, everyone has been encouraging to go ahead with masks. What PSTA has done is provided each of our drivers with masks, gloves, shields that go over the face, so that when they're handling anyone in wheelchair, you know, they have extra protection. Plus we have the bus shields on every single bus that we have. So there's a lot that we can all do. The requirements are not there because you can't always get all of the PPE. We're finding ways to do it, and our local partners here in St. Pete have provided hand sanitizers as well, which from the vodka distillery, which I think is quite unique. So we've been able to provide something to each of our employees. And I would encourage everyone else to do so as well if they haven't done so already.
So what about the riders?
The riders, what we are doing is basically announcing like essential trips only. And that has been very difficult because there's no enforcement to that that is out there, other than what you have in each of your counties, where you're basically saying to shelter in place or stay at home. But there's no real teeth to enforcing that, sadly enough.
Okay.
Any other questions for me?
I don't think so. Any other questions for Debbie before we can move on?
Mr. Chairman, Bob Lasher of PSTA had raised his hand. I admitted him to the meeting. I don't know if he'd like to be recognized and add to this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. You're recognized.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to add to what Debbie was saying. We have started this week a campaign where we strongly encourage and have signage all over the system, all of our riders to wear masks at all times. And as far as HART, I was reading a press release they sent out on the 20th that they have actually reduced their service. They were operating at a Sunday service, and they were going to cut back a little bit more on that. I could probably send that along if you'd like to see that.
That would be helpful. Thank you. And thanks for that advisory. Other questions or comments on this important item? Obviously, we are all going through an evolution of what to do and how to proceed. And And my kudos to the agencies for being proactive in this and requiring the correct PPE and getting that into the good work you guys are continuing to do. So thank you so much for that. Other questions before we move on to the committee reports? Okay, thank you. Next item is the committee reports, and the chair recognizes Cliff Manuel for the legislative subcommittee report.
Thank you, Chair Holton. We had no action items for our legislative committee last week, but we did get a very important update from Ron Pierce, and I'd like him to provide the same presentation to the board. If you could recognize him, I would appreciate it.
Happy to do so. Ron, you're recognized and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, board members. I appreciate the opportunity with you this morning. Quick update on a couple of items. Number one, as you all know, session ended last month, and I have good news to report. We did get our $1.5 million in non-recurring revenue for operations once again, so that's great news. It is once again non-recurring dollars out of the Transportation Trust Fund. We have a few folks to thank you on that. Senator Brandis, President Galvano, and Senator Hudson were very helpful, as well as Representative Polito. They were all instrumental in making sure that we were in the budget. Again, it's 1.5 million, just like last year for operations. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Chairman and board members, it's probably good we got Transportation Trust Fund dollars and not any type of non-recurring or recurring revenue, because there is an opportunity, I think, where the legislature will have to go back and potentially look at the budget to make some adjustments to it, because I think, as we all would recognize during this call and meeting, that whatever estimates they built the budget upon and they passed the budget, those revenue estimates are going to be obviously way off at this point. So there is a talk about going back for a special session. Yes, the legislature does have almost $3 billion in reserves to be able to draw upon. They're going to have some federal dollars they're going to have to allocate as well. We're not sure of the timing of it yet. It's probably going to be sometime in June. But what I would tell you is, if they go back and have to look at reserves and look at the federal dollars and allocating those, there could be an opportunity where they have to go back and reopen portions of the budget as well and make some adjustments. We're hopeful that our dollars, since they are not general revenue dollars, that they're Transportation Trust Fund and non-recurring, we'll do our best. We believe those would be safe, but obviously we need to do our job and ensure that the governor approves, and more importantly, the legislature doesn't make any adjustments if they have to go back and do a special session in June. Let me also talk about, as you all know, we were working on a piece of legislation for you, a TBARTA bill. Unfortunately, that didn't quite make it to the finish line. It passed the Florida Senate on a unanimous vote. We ran into a procedural hiccup in the Florida House. And unfortunately, and I won't bore you with the details of it, but unfortunately, the bill was not able to get to the finish line. We do need to thank Senator Rasan and Representative Diamond. They were excellent bill sponsors, did all they could to get the bills to the finish line. Had a great conversation with David and the team. And I'll be honest with you, it's probably maybe a blessing the bill didn't pass, because there's some things we want to go back and try to do next year. Obviously, being, one of the things we wanted that was not included in the final version of the bill was being able to do video conferencing such as this. There's some things that we want to try to tweak and maybe put in there that during states of emergency that we would be allowed to be able to do that. As we start looking ahead, Mr. Chairman, I know the 2021 session seems like a long ways away, and a lot of things that are happening right now in our world that's going to impact that session well before next March. But there are a couple of things I think we need to start working on as an organization. I think number one is, again, working on legislation for next year, lining up bill sponsors, and also incorporating any new ideas that we may have as a board. And also start looking at permanent funding. As I shared with the committee, Mr. Chairman and board members, we can't continue to go back and try to get non-recurring revenue. At some point, we're not going to get it. So at some point, we need to look at a permanent funding source. And we have some ideas there. And I think there's some conversations we need to have with DOT and incoming House and Senate leadership. So we're prepared to have those conversations when the timing is right. But I think those are two issues, again, looking at legislation again for next year, but also looking at permanent funding. And the last thing I'll touch on, Mr. Chairman, is board appointments. We do have some gubernatorial appointments that are still outstanding. We have been in contact with the governor's appointments office and are hopeful that there'll be some movement on those within the next few weeks. I'll pause there and see if there's any questions or comments from board members.
Thank you, Ron. Questions? Well, thank you so much for that report, and we look forward to working with you. And I assume the legislative subcommittee will be in touch regarding tweaking the legislative ask procedurally for the next session coming up. So thanks for that report, and thanks for the
Thank you,
great.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Janet.
Well, I wasn't going to say anything, but my better angels or my not so better angels are getting the best of me. I did want to share that I really strongly believe that it is not too soon for us to be having a discussion with regard to permanent funding from the legislature, because we cannot keep on moving forward with our plans for there's a lot going on at TBARTA with our vision and our 41 miles feasibility plan that we're trying very hard to jumpstart with the BRT Central Avenue line. And this coronavirus hiccup that we've all been living through is hopefully going to be on the downside now as the governor looks to make decisions sometime early next week about lifting the executive order or not. And we in county government, I'm sure our regional partners are doing the same thing, are looking at how we can respond in consort with whatever it is the governor decides to do. That said, there's a lot, as Ron said, a lot of issues that are going to be coming before the legislature. And I think that it would behoove us to start now really working on a permanent funding stream. I know he said they had a lot of ideas about ways in which to make that happen, but some of us have very strong relationships in the legislature still. And I know I was in Tallahassee several times this spring and had some one-on-ones with the new incoming leadership in the House and in the Senate. And I think we can capitalize on them. If ever we were going to do good things for Tampa Bay, now is the time to really put our plans in place, because leaders on both sides of the House and in the Senate are coming from Tampa Bay. So I know I'm not part of that legislative group anymore, but I am still a strong voice on the issue.
Thanks for those comments. Other comments? Okay, thank you, Cliff and Ron, for that great report. And now I'll turn to the Finance Committee report, and Janet, you're recognized.
All right, thank you very much. And I do think we have good news to report with regard to where we are with the finances at TBARTA. And I would first like to see, do we have any public comment, Jennifer, for our Finance Committee?
No,
This is
ma'am.
Cindy, I'm managing the public comment, and I can say there is nobody on the line and no emails have been received.
Okay, and then since we have a quorum for our meeting today, do we need to take another roll call vote, Jennifer, on the Finance Committee? It's on the agenda.
That's not necessarily an action item. We will need to when we speak about the grant resolution.
All right, then Debbie, do you want to speak for the line of credit update, please?
Yes, thank you. We have been working with Pilot Bank and our general counsel, Alan Zimmett, and Dwayne Draper, who's their bond counsel, through a line of credit. I think BMO has made some fantastic progress with Pilot Bank, and we hope to bring this to the May committee meeting.
All right.
The good news, yeah, I will say this, and I mentioned this yesterday on a call. One of the good parts of some of the delay is the interest rates now are so low, it'll be advantageous to TBARTA.
Great, maybe they'll give us more money.
But that concludes my report.
Thank you very much. David, I know you already spoke to the CARES Act, but do you have any additional information to give?
No, ma'am.
Thank you. Cindy, would you like to speak to the resolution?
Yes, thank you very much. Cindy Raskin, Director of Commuter Services for TBARTA. Before you is an action item We're requesting that you approve resolution 2020-03, which accepts $870,000 in grant funding from the Florida Department of Transportation to administer the District 7 Commuter Assistance Program. As you know, we are the designated program manager for that for the Tampa Bay area. We are operating it as Commute Tampa Bay, and we assist businesses and commuters with programs designed to reduce single occupant vehicle trips through carpool, vanpool, transit, telecommuting, biking, and walking. So this resolution, as I said, is accepting the grant funding allocation for the 2020 fiscal year program in the amount of $870,000, which is in the budget. I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions from anyone on the commuter assistance program? Anybody? Hearing none, we will move on. Oh, we need to vote on that, don't we?
Mr.
Move
approval.
Yeah, I'll call for a, Janet, why don't you make the motion to accept that resolution? If you get a second, call it.
Okay, well, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the commuter assistance program resolution as Debbie has outlined.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Who seconds?
Bellamy.
Thank you. And any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Janik, just to note that Mayor Kreisman has joined the meeting. Just want to make sure you're aware.
Welcome.
Good morning, Mayor.
He's on mute.
Good morning. Good morning.
All right, so I do believe we do need to take a vote now on the CAP grant resolution. I will go ahead and call roll call. Jim Holton.
There's no public comment. Please signify that.
There is no public comment for this item.
Just for the record, we need to make that clear if someone was looking back at this from a year from now that we asked for comment. Yes, please call the roll.
Okay. Jim Holton.
Yes.
Cliff Manuel.
Yes.
Commissioner Janet Long.
Yes.
Commissioner John Mitten.
Yes.
Commissioner Pat Kemp.
Yes.
Commissioner Reggie Bellamy.
Yes.
Commissioner Catherine Starkey.
Yes.
Commissioner Karen Seal.
Yes.
Mayor Rick Kreisman.
Yes.
Mayor Jane Castor.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes.
Thank you. Janet, anything further to report from the Finance Committee?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we would like to hear now from Melanie Williams, if she's on the line, to give the audit report for TBARTA.
Thank you. Melanie, you're recognized.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I'm here to report the the year-to-date March financials for 2020. The year-to-date through the month of March, we had a net surplus of $181,000, and this was $218,000 under the budgeted amount of $400,000. Looking at the revenues, we were under budget of approximately $2.4 million, and this under budget amount was primarily due to the timing of the PD&E and technology study. We were also under budget of approximately $2.1 million with expenses, and this was primarily due to the expenses related to that PD&E and technology studies. Moving on to the balance sheet here, at the end of March, we had our accounts receivable balance of $900,000, and then our AP, which is accounts payable, had a balance of $500,000. And then that was a big improvement from our last period, which was $1.6 million in AR. So we reduced our AR of approximately $700,000. So that's very good news. At the end of March, we had a total balance in the bank available cash of $310,000. And that pretty much concludes my financial summary report for March 2020.
Thank you, Melanie. Questions?
Any questions?
Good job.
Thank you.
Janet, any additional reports, information?
Now that is the end of the Finance Committee report, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the great job you and the team are doing there. And it's great to hear that we are in good financial state, given the situation worldwide here. So great job, and we look forward to continuing to look for that revenue source and stream from the legislature and getting our grant designation approval through Washington.
Chair Holton, I made a slight error because Melanie is prepared to give the March 2020 financials if you're ready to hear them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Please.
I apologize. Melanie?
Yes, I just presented the March 2020 financials. Do you want me to present them again, or?
That's up to Chair Holton.
Whichever. Did you have any additional reports, Melanie, or was that all you had to share with the board?
That concluded the summary of March 2020 financials. If anyone has any questions, I'm glad to take them.
Okay. Any questions?
I'd like to know if all the bills are paid.
Yes, I think from last week from a finance meeting, Tyndale Oliver had mentioned, and yes, we did receive payment for FDOT for Tyndale Oliver, so we're in good shape.
So now that we are current with everyone, can we please work really, really hard to stay that way? I know the Department of Transportation would be very grateful.
Absolutely. They've been doing a wonderful job getting us our funding and reimbursements.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Janet. Anything else? All right, that concludes the Finance Committee report. Rich McLean is now recognized for the Policy Committee.
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure Rich has joined us yet, so I'm happy to take that if you like.
All right, thank you, David. I'll recognize you. I didn't know whether Rich had joined yet.
Thank you. Just a couple of items were on the Policy Committee agenda. They did review and discuss the resolution regarding the suspension of the physical quorum. And then the other item was related to our procurement manual. You all are aware that TBARTA has applied to FTA to become a designated recipient, and we have received positive feedback from them regarding the information that we sent to them. The one area that they would like some updates to is regarding our procurement guidelines and procedures. So we have spent the past several months making updates to our procurement policy, and we presented that information to the Policy Committee last week. So similar to what we did a couple of months ago with our employee handbook with general policies and procedures, we're doing it again for the procurement policies and procedures. I had a phone call with Mr. Zimmett, our general counsel, the other day, and so we're going to make some additional changes to it that were not part of what the Policy Committee received last week. And our plan is to present the updated manual to the Policy Committee again at the May board meeting, and then recommend approval from the full board also at the May board meeting.
Thank you, David. Any comments or questions for David? Okay, thank you for that Policy Committee report. Next is a Citizens Advisory Committee report, and Bill Johnson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
What a great view there, Bill.
Yes, I wish I could say that was Clearwater Beach, but it's just a generic background. Members of the board, Mr. Chairman, the Citizens Advisory Committee met on April 15th via Zoom conference, and we had a quorum. The only action item was the review and recommendation for the Envision 2030 plan, which was on your agenda later in this meeting. Mr. Bill Ball brought us the draft executive summary and the draft final report. The committee voted to recommend your adoption of the proposed regional transit vision network, but with some modifications. You will recall that we had a preliminary presentation of the summary Envision 2030 plan in February. We reported that action to you at your February board meeting, But 2 months ago, we suggested a slight modification to give more recognition to the important regional transportation disadvantage network and to highlight the importance of the TBARTA van pool program. Now that we saw the full report, in our opinion, we did not see sufficient inclusion of either the regional TD program or the van pools in this plan. In February, we also recommended giving more attention to the importance of grassroots support as an integral part of the plan. When we looked at the full summary report this month, we noted that the report does a good job of presenting the recommended physical solution, but is largely insufficient in describing why it is needed. Just comparing Tampa Bay's position to other benchmark cities does not describe how the proposed system will enhance the life experiences here of our local citizens, in our opinion. The motion to recommend your adoption passed contingent on the modifications being included in the final report, which I understand will be happening over the next couple of months. Also, we heard a very informal presentation on Commute Tampa Bay, and our next meeting is scheduled for June 17th, possibly at the Hart office or by Zoom. Mr. Chair, that is my report.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that report. Questions for Bill? None being heard, we'll turn next to the Transit Management Committee report, and Kurt, you're recognized.
Chair, I don't believe that Kurt is on the line.
Okay, David, would you give that report, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair, the Transit Management Committee received the same presentation regarding Envision 2030 that was delivered to the CAC, same presentation that you all are going to receive later this morning. And the TMC did vote to recommend that the board adopt the report as presented.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for David regarding this report? Okay, the final item in this category is the June board meeting, and David, you're recognized again to brief us on that.
Yes, thank you. So our 2019 financial audit is currently being conducted. Our initial intent was to have it completed during the month of May and presented to the board in May to be approved. But due to COVID-19 and the fact that people are working remotely now instead of being able to come into the office and review documents there, it's taking a little bit longer than initially expected. So the audit will not be complete in time for the May board meeting. And we are suggesting that we go ahead and schedule a June board meeting so that we can present the results of the audit to the board and accept them before the June 30 deadline. You may recall June was one of those months that we canceled a meeting when the board was interested in reducing the number of meetings from 12. We went down to 9. June was one of those months. So wanted to suggest the idea of adding a June meeting again.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, and I spoke with the independent auditors, and they amplified the same point that everyone is somewhat behind, given you have to work from home, and that's especially true for auditors and accountants because the records are not as easily accessible from a home venue and so forth. So that sounds perfectly reasonable to me, and I wanted to get a consensus from the board. Does anyone have any opposition to a June board meeting or other suggestions that they'd like to raise?
This is Commissioner Starkey.
Yes.
I guess at our committee meetings, I mentioned the Tampa Bay trip to Costa Rica, which is officially canceled. So we had talked about June 19th. We can also throw out there the June 12th, see what works for people's calendars.
Thanks, appreciate that. David, it seems like everyone is on board with that, so I would direct staff to go ahead and properly notice and figure out a good date for that June meeting.
Okay, we'll definitely do that. And we'll also explore possible locations. Since June is a couple months out, we don't know what the state of the world is going to be like at that point in time. I know there's discussion around the country of beginning to reopen businesses, and in the event that this executive order is lifted in Florida and we're not able to do complete virtual meetings at that point in time, there's a chance that we may need to do a physical meeting or at least a hybrid meeting with maybe some people present and some people online. So we'll keep that in mind. We will plan for the worst, and we will respond accordingly.
Great, thank you so much for that. Sounds good. Next item is the chairman's report. I have nothing specific to report. I just would like to thank staff and council and everyone that brought this meeting together. It's going very smoothly and seamlessly, which is great for a first meeting. And on a very personal note, I would like to thank all our elected officials in the Tampa Bay area for the outstanding job of keeping us safe and making this community a great place to live even under very difficult circumstances. So thank all of you for that. That said, I will recognize David again for the executive director's report.
Thank you. So just a couple of updates for you. The Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, that's the PTASP. It's related to the agreement with Qatar that the board approved back in February. This is a safety plan that's going to establish processes and procedures to support implementation of our safety management system. We held a kickoff meeting on March 20th and held some subsequent meetings since then to discuss and review various elements of the plan. Our intent is to send you the final plan in June, now at the June board meeting that we're going to schedule, and ask you to adopt it in July so we can meet the July 20th due date for that plan. Another federal requirement for transit agencies is a TAM plan, a Transit Asset Management Plan. This is a tool that was put in place back in 2018 to identify what federally funded transit assets exist, what their condition is, and how they perform, and to basically help project funding that'll be needed when those assets need to be replaced. We don't own any facilities, equipment, or infrastructure, and the only rolling stock we support are the vans that are part of our van pool program. So our plan is pretty simple. We previously met this TAM plan requirement through inclusion in PSTA's plan, but now that we have more than 100 vans in our van pool program and are applying to become a designated recipient, FTA would like us to have our own plan. So we're working with Tyndale Oliver, who we brought on to help develop our initial submission, and then we'll be required to update it every 4 years. This is not a requirement for being approved as a designated recipient, but our intent is to go ahead and complete the plan by May 31st and to have it behind us anyway. I mentioned this basically just to highlight another milestone that we'll reach as TBARTA evolves into a self-sufficient regional transit authority. Finally, I want to mention the telework webinar series. TBARTA has teamed up with commuter service agencies in districts 1 and 5 to offer a series of 3 webinars on teleworking. They're covering topics such as strategies and best practices for managing teleworking, collaborative technologies for teleworking, and embracing cultural change to support teleworking beyond COVID-19. They're being conducted at noon over the course of 3 Fridays. They actually began last Friday. So there's another one today, and the third one will be next week. And they're free to all participants. Particularly in the world we're living in today, we just thought this was a great way to provide additional information and education on one of the many options that are available under the Commuter Assistance Program. And then finally, I know everybody's focused on staying healthy right now, but we have had an active month of birthday celebrations, and I wanted to extend some warm birthday wishes to some TBARTA board members. Commissioners Kemp and Mitten and Cliff Manuel, our vice chair. Wanted to wish you all a happy birthday this month.
Happy birthday.
That concludes my report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you go ahead and just talk briefly about future meeting subjects now so we can go right to the presentations?
Yes, no new topics on that list. We did push the Flamingo Regional Fair card presentation, but then, we've got the other 5 items that have been on there, and it's just going to be a matter of when we're able to schedule them accordingly at upcoming board meetings.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for David from his executive director's report?
Mr. Chair.
Chair Holton, Cliff May, can I be recognized?
Janet was up first, I think, Cliff, and then you'll recognize right after her.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask if it might be appropriate. I think those of us that are elected officials and those of us that represent our regional partners would be very interested in some strategic thought process with regard to what we may think now are our anticipated ask of our regional partners with regard to their financial contributions for this next year going forward. I know we're all going to be really scrubbing and going through our budget process here in the next few weeks to jumpstart our planning for our county budget in 2021. And I think having some idea of what these plans, especially as it relates to the Envision 2030 plan, mean for our budgets could be very beneficial to us. And so to that end, I think there are some very difficult conversations that need to be had. And I would like to ask the staff, David and his staff, to please come up with a specified time for us to sit down and start those discussions and have a finance meeting prior to the next time that we meet, which I guess is going to be in June, but that may be a little far out there to be giving our regional partners some notice with regard to what we anticipate, if that makes sense to my partners that are elected.
Comments?
Well, it's always good to know what we need to anticipate in our upcoming budgets. And yeah, so I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Properly falls under the role of the Finance Committee, Janet. So we probably want to maybe schedule a separate meeting with the committee staff and the committee to discuss that very topic, I would assume.
That's what I'm asking for. Thank you.
That's perfect reason.
And I have given that heads up to my staff and my board that, there's something coming. I don't know what it is, but we need to plan for something. So yeah, it'd be good to flesh it out a little bit.
Thank you.
David, and you can coordinate that with Janet and others to reach out to local governments and counties and so forth to do that, I assume.
Will do, Chair.
Thank you very much. Next, we have the presentations and the draft Envision 2030 plan. Bill Ball is recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, good. Mr. Chair, members of the board, it's good to be back and here to present the Envision 2030 plan. We got the draft together. The full plan and the executive summary was in your packets. And I'd like to give you an overview of that and then see if you have any questions. What we're looking for today is really just your approval to move into a public comment period. And other than that, we'll be coming back. And then now that you're having the June meeting, we would like to propose coming back in June for adoption so we have more time to take public comment. So what I want to emphasize today are three main things. I want to highlight the regional transit vision, kind of how we got there and an overview of what it looks like. Secondly, stepping back from that vision, what do we envision would be appropriate in the next 10 years and a target for trying to get funded. And then third, I want to highlight the calls to action and specific recommendations that the board should consider moving forward. Next slide. We've talked a lot with the board and with the committees about how we define regional transit. And go ahead there, Chris, that's good. And basically, the high level agreement on the definition that basically it's any transit project that crosses county lines, plus any transit project that will ultimately cross county lines in the future. We also got some clear direction from the board that we need to make sure we have significant coordination with the jurisdictions throughout the region when we're considering implementation of new services in the region, and that we should focus our efforts first on commuters as a priority and providing premium transit services to those commuters. Next slide. So how did we get to that regional transit vision network? We did largely begin with the work that's been done in the past by the local transit agencies, by the MPOs, the regional transit feasibility plan. We did a lot of technical work updates ourselves. And then we also had a lot of public outreach over the past year as well. So we sat down with the staff from the transit agencies, and all of that came together in what we're presenting today in that regional transit vision. Next slide. Now this basically, I'm going to show in a series of slides how we build that regional transit vision, but an important distinction here is what I show as proposed to be TBARTA's responsibility versus proposed to be local agency responsibility, both of which are critical to the overall regional transit vision network. This, of course, is the regional rapid transit corridor connecting downtown St. Pete to Wesley Chapel. The next layer is the 5 intermodal centers that Florida DOT is evaluating along that corridor. Next is other regional rapid transit, and right now that basically is the green line, which reflects a premium connection across the Gandy Bridge in the future. Next is the rail transit corridors throughout the 5-county region. These are opportunities in the future that need to be part of the vision. And next is passenger ferry. And we've got a couple of segments here. Of course, the seasonal services out there today, the connection between South Hillsborough and MacDill Air Force Base that's been talked about, and in talking with Manatee, a future connection between downtown St. Pete and the city of Palmetto. And then the final layer is the regional express bus routes in orange that provide connections throughout the 5-county area. So this is the area and the vision that we propose to be TBARTA's responsibility. Next slide basically shows what we deem to be regionally significant local service. So these are existing routes that are operated by the local transit providers, but are still very important to regional transit connectivity. We also envision future routes that would be regionally significant as well, that would come online in the future to that regional transit vision as well. So in the next slide, we basically show everything: the TBARTA responsibility, the local agency responsibility, and here's our regional transit vision. I do want to emphasize a couple of items, and they're not really evident when you look at a map. First of all, it is the Commute Tampa Bay services that are provided, the van pools, the rideshare services, and their support with working from home, which is very important in this climate as well. And then the other thing is the regional transportation disadvantage services that TBARTA is now exploring to see what those gaps may be, and they could fill those gaps in the future. The bottom line is when we look at this vision, what this can provide to the community is increased job access. It's estimated that the average resident of the region would have 50% greater job access than they have today. And if you just look at the segment of the populations that's a low to moderate income, then it's even much greater than that. So it's a job access answer if we're able to implement this vision over time. Next slide. The other thing that we wanted TBARTA to be able to present is an understanding of major transit projects that are already underway throughout the region. These major transit projects are in project development or planning phases, and you can see how they very much relate to each other. The regional rapid transit, it's the Central Avenue BRT, the Florida Avenue BRT, the passenger ferry services, the streetcar extension, the rail connection between downtown Tampa and USF, and of course the 5 intermodal centers as well. All of those are going on right now, and they have strong interrelationships and should be recognized in this regional plan. The next slide shows those same projects. There's 8 of them that are and where they are in their development process. For example, the Central Avenue BRT project, the orange bar, is the furthest along. It's in final design. I'll mention a couple of others, regional rapid transit and the streetcar extension. They're in conceptual design. So what we wanted to be able to display is projects that are already going on in the region that are critical to the regional network, but they're already making progress today and how they relate to each other. Next slide. So we have the vision. Our next step was to pull back and develop alternatives, do an evaluation of those alternatives, and then basically put together priorities for what would be appropriate for the next 10 years. Next slide. What we start with are some short-term regional priorities, and these are essentially improvements to existing routes that are out there today. So you see those routes indicated on this table. What I'll emphasize here is the importance of that final column, which is the responsible entity. Even though these are currently provided by local providers today, we do envision in this plan that at some point TBARTA would take responsibility for these truly regional services. The three that are recommended here are the 100X, Skyway, and 300X. Next slide. This shows the long-term regional priorities. On the right is the regional express bus routes. These are new express bus routes that don't exist today. And then on the left are premium transit investments that would be part of the priorities as well. Next slide. So what we did is we took those priorities and we put together 3 scenarios to identify what possible options we could pursue in that next 10-year time period for Envision 2030. Status quo, low impact scenario, and high impact scenario. So let's talk about each one of those a little bit further. The first one, status quo, essentially maintaining what TBARTA is doing today. They would focus on Commute Tampa Bay, expanding their van pool program, expanding their commuter services, and they would continue their planning efforts with the regional rapid transit, the transit technologies, and other future regional transit planning services. In this case, revenue assumptions, there's no change. We're going to assume that we only have the sources we have today. The next is the low impact scenario, which basically builds upon that status quo, and it adds and assumes the transfer of those 3 regional express bus routes to TBARTA's responsibility. TBARTA would be responsible for making improvements to those routes and the capital needed, the buses needed to operate those routes. And this would also include a more rigorous assessment of what the regional transportation disadvantage needs are and filling those gaps. The revenue assumptions for this scenario were basically TBARTA would now be assumed to be eligible for the state block grant. That's possible with the submittal of the Envision 2030 plan. We also assumed in this scenario that there would be that the counties would step up for that required local match. Much as they have today, this would have to increase in the future to match any increases in that state block grant over time. Next slide. Now, the high impact scenario, this is the one with the most significant transit investments. Again, it builds on the low impact scenario, but it also includes 6 new regional express bus routes. It includes the first phase of regional rapid transit, which we don't know what the first phase is for sure yet, but we did make an assumption for the purpose of this plan, which was the first phase being from downtown St. Pete to downtown Tampa. It also assumes the capital needed for those investments, including the West Shore and Gateway modal centers that would come online with that phase 1 of regional rapid transit. It also assumes a future study, much like the study that's going on today, that would look at extending regional rapid transit down into Manatee and Sarasota counties. The revenue assumptions for this scenario basically assumes a small increase in the state block grant based on precedent we've seen in South Florida, where the regional entity, in their case, Tri-Rail, was able to receive some of the credit for the regional population. 10% was what they were able to receive. And that's one of the items in the formula for the state block grant. And then, of course, there would be a slight increase in the local match to match that increase as well. Next slide. So those were the 3 scenarios that we wanted to highlight. And we're illustrating in this slide the high impact scenario. This is what it looks like on a map. And basically that's what we want to recommend as the preferred scenario moving forward. Now, if we look at the costs of these scenarios, let's go there next. First, we'll start with operating costs. And I will emphasize that these are for the entire 10 years, not an annual cost, but the cumulative cost over the 10-year period in millions of dollars for each of the scenarios. And it goes from the 42 million in the status quo to 81 million in the low impact scenario to 181 million in the high impact scenario. If we look at the revenues that we assumed are available, you'll see that we have basically a balanced budget for the status quo. In the low impact scenario, we have a small deficit, relatively small over 10 years of 23 million, and then a more substantial deficit in the high impact scenario, nearly 100 million. So that gives you a sense on the operating cost side. The next slide goes into capital costs. If we look at the capital costs, you see that capital investment in the status quo and low impact are very small. And not until the high impact do we get to a major capital investment for a transit project, largely related to regional rapid transit. You see that increases to 420 million. If we add the assumed revenues that are available in green, you see we're essentially balanced in the status quo. We have a small deficit in capital in the low impact scenario. And then our big deficit is in the high impact scenario, 409 million over that 10-year period. Next slide. So that was really our summary of the scenarios. And we certainly are recommending support for the high impact scenario, which leads into what I'll talk about now is the calls to action and specific recommendations. We've organized them into 3 areas: policy, funding, and commitment and collaboration. And we've come up with 13 specific action items, 26 specific recommendations. And I'm not going to go through each of them one by one, but I do want to hit some highlights in the presentation today. So I'll talk about each one of these briefly. Next slide. First one, and go ahead and hit again, Chris. Policy call to action. Of course, we want the committee's support, and any comments they're providing, we're certainly going back and discussing with TBARTA staff to see how we can address them. But we need the board's adoption of Envision 2030. We certainly are looking for support from all the partners throughout the region, and it's clear that we need to present and summarize the current plan to all of our partners. But then also we need to do that periodically to give them updates on the implementation as it goes forward. A key element of our recommendations in working with TBARTA staff is the establishment of a blue ribbon committee, basically a committee that's made up of representatives of the stakeholders throughout the region to help work with TBARTA on guiding the implementation of the resulting Envision 2030 plan. Next slide. The funding call to action. The first one I'll mention on the right there is the dedicated funding for agency operation. That was talked about earlier by Ron Pierce, and the need for TBARTA to get in a situation where they're not making this request on an annual basis, that they have some stability in funding and planning for the future. The second one I'll highlight there is the need for these formal interlocal agreements with our county partners to have that commitment to make that state block grant match. And to give you a feel for how much that is, it really is an increase from what the counties are contributing today, which is about $550,000, to what we've assumed in the high impact scenario would require about 1.6 million in the 10th year of the high impact scenario plan. So gradually increasing from that 550 to 1.6. The other two, again, I think what Commissioner Long mentioned is the need to discuss in more detail what those other potential funding sources are that would give dedicated funding to TBARTA. When I mention them here and when we talk about them in the details of the Envision 2030 plan, it will likely require some legislative change at the state level to achieve that. So that's something that would need to be part of those next discussions that Commissioner Long was mentioning. Next slide. The last area is the commitment and collaboration area. Again, this is where we really need to cultivate champions at many levels. We need champions from the board to support this plan moving forward, to support the funding moving forward. We need champions from each of the county commissions. We need champions at the state legislative delegation level. And we also need to then pursue that resolutions of support from all of our stakeholders and partners throughout the region. And as Bill Johnson mentioned, we also need grassroots support for this effort as well. Now, I'll mention again the Blue Ribbon Committee because I think that's going to be key going forward. We need that stakeholder support through the Blue Ribbon Committee to identify and see through implementation what those new funding sources might be to make the high impact scenario become a reality. Next slide. So we talked about this slide in the past. And the bottom line is there are values that TBARTA provides today, but until we have the greater investment that we're talking about in Envision 2030, we will not be able to see the values that are on this slide, but this is what we need to be working toward. Bottom line is, as I mentioned earlier, that vision substantially increases job access to the average resident and even more so to the low to moderate income resident. So job access is key, stimulating economic development. When we get to these levels of investment, we start to see those opportunities, especially around stations related to major corridor investments like regional rapid transit. And then really overall is improving the regional competitiveness. That's really handled pretty strongly in the executive summary and the report. And we certainly borrowed from the work that was done by the Tampa Bay Partnership to compare our region's competitiveness to other regions around the country. Bottom line is providing mobility options, job access, and improving quality of life for residents, visitors, and commuters in the region. Next slide. So next steps. We did present to the technical and citizens group last week. You heard their recommendations today. We are looking for, and of course the board meeting changed to the 24th, but we are looking to initiate a public comment period today. And I'm glad and hopeful that we can then come back for adoption in June instead of May to give us more time to have a longer public comment period. We are on the agendas to present to committees and the PSTA and HART boards. That's coming up in May and June as well. And then of course, I mentioned before that we look forward to coming back to the board for adoption now in June, perhaps instead of May. And then our task will then be to present to the county commissions and then share the results of this plan to the legislative delegation. With that, that's my high-level summary today, and I'll be glad to answer any questions or take any comments going forward.
Thank you, Bill. Questions for Bill? Thank you for that report. We look forward to continuing working closely with you and to the next interim report that you'll have. Thanks for that. You need a pat to recognize.
Yeah, I have a question for Bill. This Pat Kemp. So originally, the intent, as I understood it, first of all, we're in a really terrible time here with coronavirus. I mean, some people are predicting even a state budget collapse. We have Mitch McConnell, has said that he expects some states to go bankrupt. So it seems like it is not a time where going forward with this would be, hold on a second, would be an optimum time to do anything like that. And with the state legislature meeting again in June, in terms of looking at their budget, it seems very, very serious what's happening with coronavirus, as well as the impacts on transit with coronavirus and what we're looking at. And just like the van pool program has now turned into a single occupancy vehicle. And I understand that's something that's important that it happens right now, but that may be true for a year or two. So I think that is these things cannot be ignored in these times because we don't know what's going to happen. But my other consideration of all of this going forward also is I was just looking through some of the numbers, for instance, local bus routes, which we've never really been presented, local bus routes versus these express bus routes. And you mentioned the 100X and the 300X, and I looked at their numbers for the past year when things were doing well. And what I came out with is that there was approximately 106 riders per day on the 100X and 69 riders per day on the 300X. Now, we have never been presented with these numbers. That is, the 100X is the St. Petersburg to Tampa. 300X is the beaches to the airport. And again, it's 106 per day and 69 per day. If you look at the biggest routes in PSTA, you're going to get 3,500 riders per day. And that's true of about 4 routes in at HART. We get near about 3,000 riders per day as compared to 106 or 69 riders per day. And I think we're going to have to be thinking very, very carefully about our resources and where we spend them and how we spend them, providing very desperately needed transit in these areas. So I think it's very important that we look at that. The other is that when we originally started, or when it became a transit entity 3 years ago, the big sell on this was we're going to bring into our region the dollars that they're bringing in to Miami-Dade and West Palm and Broward, where the dollars flow through FDOT and they totally pay for operations and capital of the express buses between Miami-Dade, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach. We're not doing that here. We're not bringing any equivalent dollars, but yet this is an ask for local matching dollars, which I can't even imagine are going to happen now. But also, there wouldn't be it wouldn't be advisable in terms of the kinds of service that we're talking about here. So I just wanted to point that out, because I think this would be a real loss for us.
Thank you, Pat. Other comments?
Chair.
Yes, yes.
Cliff Manuel did want to speak after David's report, and he was not.
Oh yes, my apologies. Why don't we allow that in the old and new business, and I'll give Cliff the floor then under that section.
Okay.
My apologies to that, Cliff. I had that as a note here actually that I did that. So my apologies, and I'll recognize you under old business. So let's continue on with any questions for Bill or comments. Okay, none being heard. Thank you, Bill, for that report, and we will look forward to hearing from you again in June. Now recognize Scott Pringle on the Regional Rapid Transit update.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, TBARTA Board. I hope you can hear me well. Since our last meeting, we've made quite a bit of progress. So Chris, if you want to go ahead and get started with the next slide. Thank you. So the last time we met, we had a great conversation about identifying alternatives that can be developed and advanced through the project. And with that direction from the TBARTA Board, we have been doing just that. We've been working on those concepts. We've had 2 opportunities for public involvement, major opportunities. We held several workshops earlier in the year, and we were fortunate enough to get in a couple of charrettes, 6 different charrettes, which I'm going to talk about later in the presentation, in early March, right before the stay-at-home orders were beginning to occur. So we're working on those concepts. We've been collecting public input and moving forward towards that completion of milestone 2. So this is the schedule here. You can see, as we noted, we're on track. Even with the current challenges, we are moving forward full steam ahead. We are absolutely prepared to bring forward some results of the conceptual development that we've been doing over the past several months at your next board meeting in May. The focus that is a big part of that milestone 2, are 2 elements, both defining the alignment as well as defining the station types. So what you see here is a quick reminder of those alignments that we discussed at your prior meeting. You can see, working from left to right, is alternative 2, which is the recommendation coming from the Regional Transit Feasibility Plan. Alternative 3 actually looks at dedicated transit all the way from Tampa into Pasco County, whereas alternative 4 is looking at dedicated transit lane all the way from St. Petersburg to downtown Tampa. And alternative 5 is evaluating almost nearly 100% dedicated lanes across the entire 41-mile corridor, with the exception of getting out of the interstate environment to make good connections to downtown Tampa. Next slide, please. So in developing these concepts, Brian and TBARTA staff and I have spent a significant amount of time with FDOT staff, getting to really understand all the details and aspects of the TBNX program, and making sure that we understand all aspects of how this project can fit in with TBNX, the feasibility of designing our project as part of that larger program, the safety and the design capability of our project in relationship to TBNX. I not sure if I can even tell you the number. We've had, well, I would say in excess of 20 meetings at this point with FDOT to make sure that coordination is occurring effectively. We've also had some really great input from our executive team, which is, of course, TBARTA staff, but also includes FDOT staff and the 3 transit agencies, Pasco, Pinellas, and Hillsborough. Had some good conversations about, what are we looking at as far as operations, what are the preferences from those transit agencies, relationship to operations, safety, and access. So with that, I'm going to actually bring forward some of the concepts that we're evaluating now. Again, we'll have more information for you next month, but some of the things that we're looking at and some of the opportunities that we see is that when we start looking at in Pinellas County, we do have an opportunity for a dedicated transit lane by maximizing and expanding that outside shoulder. And you can see that typical section there in front of you on the slide. The concept is that we would need about 16 feet. 12 foot of that would be a dedicated transit lane for the BRT vehicle. And that still allows us 4 foot of shoulder for mostly for disabled vehicles, as well as major rain events where we need that drainage to be accommodated in that outside shoulder. So what we're looking at now is actually having that start right after we essentially leave the Central Avenue BRT corridor out of downtown St. Pete and carry that all the way up into the greater Gateway area, and at which time we would hopefully make a connection to an intermodal center inside of the greater Gateway area. Now, jumping across the bay, what we're looking at here is actually doing a completely standalone transit corridor that is in the median of the interstate, using that space that's been preserved by the state for transit. You can see the representation there of how we would actually go about designing that. And the really interesting thing about this, this portion of the project is that we are actively looking at concepts that can design that corridor in such a way that it's not only effective for bus rapid transit, but it'll also be available for light rail transit at some point in the future if the need so arises. So we're designing it with both of those modes in mind, making sure that we're really paying attention to our future needs within the Tampa Bay area. Next slide, please. So now as we leave downtown Tampa and we're heading up to the university area, we actually have both options on the table right now. We're both looking at an inside shoulder or an inside running lane for the transit vehicle, as well as an outside running lane. You can see the 2 typical sections here. And a lot of the decision on whether we are operating outside or inside has a lot to do with the station conversation and some of the input we're getting on from the neighborhoods as to proper station design. So with that, I'll take the next slide. So when we have conversations about operating on the outside shoulder, we've got a lot of questions to make sure, from stakeholders, from the public, as to how that would actually look and operate, making sure that we're ensuring safety. The rendering that you see here, actually, Chris, if you don't mind, can we start that rendering again from the beginning? My apologies. So before you push play, Chris, you can see here on the image that there's a solid red striped line. That's conceptually indicating where the transit lane is, and that would be for transit only. However, when we get to a situation where we're at an interchange where there's an off-ramp, we are very cognizant of the fact that we have to allow automobiles to cross that transit lane to get off at the interchange. And you can see that transition zone in this visual where you see the hatched line between solid red to hashed or dashed red line. So Chris, please go ahead and play the rendering. Thank you. So as you can see, the transit vehicle moves into that transition zone, as well as automobiles who are getting off at the interchange. As the vehicle continues to move forward, those automobiles have the ability to actually exit the interstate. And then you will see the transit vehicle continues through and back into a dedicated lane, giving it that ability to bypass congestion that may exist in the interstate. So we feel very strongly, working with our executive team, that this is preferable as far as operations, and especially when we're looking at ensuring safety for all users of that corridor. Next slide, please. So the second ingredient that we've been focused on is stations, and we've had some really great what we call station charrettes, where we've gone out to the community and had facilitated events where individuals were working with a moderator and a facilitator and working through this exercise. So Chris, go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So we had almost 100 people join us at these events that were held in early March. You can see the locations where we held those charrettes here at Bears Avenue Station area, Himes, the Tampa Seminole Heights area, State Route 54, Waters, Bird, and 62nd. We had two events that had a lower attendance at those events. A lot of that is at that time, I do believe we were starting to have some questions about the pending virus threat. So as soon as we can, we'd like to go back out and hold some more outreach for those neighborhoods. But at the current time, we're actually taking this in-person charrette format and we're designing it to be virtual, and we're hoping to have that live next month. I'll definitely be able to report back to the board on that live tool. And the great thing about that is everyone can be part of the charrettes and really provide us a lot of really good input. So what was important for us and is important for the project is that we didn't take a one-size-fits-all to the station design, and that we wanted to make sure that we understood what the right fit is for each neighborhood. And by right fit, I mean the scale of the station, the context in which the station is fitting into, and making sure it serves those neighborhoods. So we had three key activities that the charrette members engaged in. The first is we asked them to tell us about their neighborhood. And we actually used information straight from Taryn Sabia's best practices, TOD best practices that she presented to the board several months back, in which she talked about sort of neighborhood or station typologies. So we presented that exact information from her report to each one of the charrettes. And then we asked the participants to vote on what they thought that neighborhood typology should be for each one of these station areas. The second is we actually asked them to provide some high-level information or input as to what they think an ideal station location could be. And we kind of broken up in our station area into 4 quadrants and asked them to weigh in on each one of those. But it was the third exercise that I think most really enjoyed. And based on their selection of a neighborhood typology, they were given a fictional budget. And with that fictional budget, they had essentially playing cards that represented a number of different station amenities, each with its own individual cost. And they were asked to spend down that budget to build their perfect station for that neighborhood. And I think that was a really great exercise. We got an amazing amount of input, very lively conversations. It was fun. And with that, I actually have a video that I'm gonna ask Chris to start here in a second. But it's about a 5-minute video, so it's a little bit longer, but we felt it was really important that the board had the opportunity to actually hear, not just from me, but hear directly from those participants, some of the things that were important to them. So Chris, if you could please with the video.
This project, the Regional Rapid Transit Project, it's a 41-mile corridor connecting all the way from downtown St. Pete and eventually into the Wesley Chapel area. So the purpose of the project is making sure, like I mentioned before, those mobility needs, we're looking at modern mobility, we make sure it's quick, safe, reliable, frequent, and regional. Some of the other objectives that we're focused on, making sure that everything that we're doing and designing as part of the project is context sensitive to the communities it serves. And it's actually your input by joining us this afternoon in this exercise that provides me that detail to make sure that we understand what the right fit is. So now I'm actually going to ask John to come up and walk you through the next section.
So we're focusing on the station today, but the station really should reflect the neighborhood that it's in. Think about what the neighborhood is like now, and think about what the neighborhood could be like in 20 years. And that's how we're going to select the typology. The typologies that we're going to discuss really go from urban center, which is the densest, to a suburban neighborhood. And we're selecting the neighborhood typologies based on what's right for this station, what's right for this neighborhood, what's right for this community.
Literally all we're asking you to do is yell out 1 or 2 word adjectives of what you think this neighborhood should be in the future.
Multi-generational.
Multi-generational.
Healthy.
Healthy, yes.
Inclusive.
Clean and maintained.
Safe. Prosperous.
Human mobility focused.
Landscape.
Diverse.
Beautiful.
Compact.
Yeah. Reliable. Perfect. There you go. Suburban neighborhood. Urban neighborhood. Oh, urban neighborhood has it. Okay, urban neighborhood got it. Urban neighborhood has it. How about an urban neighborhood?
We really battled on this. I think the solar, what Marilyn talked about, that's something that could be negotiated. Yeah.
Of all the station locations, this one probably deserves all of those things.
I'm going to say like 50% maybe, but that have a car, but most of those cars don't run very well.
Yeah.
The Nixie's gone. And that's a free parking spot. Nobody really never goes there no more.
To that point, like I cannot emphasize enough, one of the things that was so profound to me when I found this community, I couldn't believe how beautiful it was, how well preserved. I mean, everything in my home city is gone.
I think you need this. This is nice if you want to tell people that are like somebody coming from St. Petersburg and they get here and they go, what's around me?
I would be more in favor of it.
Yeah, I would.
First, we wanted to capitalize on all the activities that were happening here now, but still looking into the future.
Here, where our big savings was with the parking, as we know that we can use existing parking because this ridership is primarily going to be during the day.
And we want to make the station attractive. We just don't want a flat roof over it. Florida, summers, sideways, wind blowing. And if it's not looking safe and attractive, nobody's going to use it.
We thought it was important to include scooter and bicycle rental facilities, and we pair that up with places for rideshare.
Everybody else did choose were the higher level materials. We thought that this station could get away with more natural feel.
We upgraded on the architectural design, we upgraded on the amenities and the materials used for it. So that way we would have something that really represented Seminole Heights, how artsy it is. Lots of amenities to encourage people to use their neighborhood as the way to get there rather than a vehicle.
We also have a parking lot, a small parking garage, but the ones that built up, because we thought maybe if Walmart or Midtown don't want to collaborate with us, we can offer them extra parking so they can also help us with some space.
Our non-negotiables, we did want to do the complete streets several blocks out because it's very important for this neighborhood.
There's such limited space. If we're creating an urban environment isn't a sea of asphalt, a sea of concrete.
For a neighborhood to have a real sense of identity, they need distinct features, and so this is how we were hoping to achieve that.
Well, that's why I kind of like this format. So what do you guys think of the format today? Was that fun? Did you guys enjoy your time?
I did. Best shred I've ever done.
Wow. I'll take that. Very good.
So like I said, that was just a quick summary of the charrettes themselves. What I have on screen ahead, in front of you is actually those 6 charrettes in the neighborhood typology that each one of the charrettes had chosen. As you would imagine, pretty straightforward. We're looking at something that's like similar to a suburban neighborhood at State Route 54 in Pasco, whereas in Hillsborough and Pinellas, we got a lot of input on, looking for an urban neighborhood station typology, with the exception of the Himes area where the Midtown development is ongoing right now, where the participants really saw that that's an opportunity for sort of a big mixed-use business center. Next slide, please. So I did ask people for some input as to a station location. Like I mentioned before, we sort of blocked out the station area into quadrants and got some really good feedback. In some cases, we had, benefits or pros and cons for all 4 quadrants and not necessarily complete consensus on a location. But there are examples, for example, in Pasco County at State Route 54, where we had some really great input, and it was pretty clear to everyone in the room that, that area around the Orange Groves was a perfect location for a station. So great consensus there. We did take a slightly different approach for the Tampa Seminole Heights area, because we know we've got some work to do in identifying, what what is the right station location in regards to the cross street that it connects to. So we asked folks to, look at whether it was Osborne, Martin Luther King, or Lake, or Florabraska. Had some really good input on Osborne, MLK, and Lake. A lot of conversations about the affordable housing development near Robles Park. The one consensus we did get from those members that were in attendance at the charrette was that maybe Florabraska is not necessarily the best location for a station because you are so close to downtown Tampa. So great input on some station locations. Next slide, Chris. What you see here is we actually quantified all that information that we collected from those charrettes in terms of people's selections as to the different station amenities. Anywhere where you see the cells are colored in blue, we found more, those are areas where we found great consensus across all 6 charrettes, where, out of the 19 tables, 2/3 of those tables were, in favor of things like wayfinding, seating, LCD monitors, bike racks, and real-time passenger information. A signature architectural style with premium materials and public art installations and landscaping. Technology was a no-brainer. Everyone saw the need for Wi-Fi and security, potentially looking at some restrooms along the way. But some of the things where we saw, some diversity across those 6 charrettes where the type of enclosures, so, kind of looking at, should it be a full canopy or an actual enclosure itself? Although we did get some really good consensus on solar, that was very popular. Yeah. Parking was a great aspect of and we spent a lot of time talking about parking because I know it's something that we've discussed here at the TBARTA board. So we got some really great input, and it did vary across the different charrettes. We gave each table the opportunity to choose as much parking or no parking as they preferred. And what we saw is that in areas like Pasco County, there was definitely an interest and understanding that a lot of people may be driving to that particular station location, so the parking was important. Whereas in Pinellas and Hillsborough and some of those urban neighborhoods, the conversation was, if we need any parking at all, maybe it's just a few spots and it's more so for ride share, Uber, Lyft connections, and taxis. So we really took that to heart when we're thinking about station design and customizing these stations to fit the neighborhood context and scale. We also had great conversations about how do you get to the station, looking at bike and pedestrian improvements, not just at the station itself, but maybe a block or several blocks out from the station, because we recognize that for someone to get and use the service, they're most likely a pedestrian, a transit user, or a bike user, so they need that type of connectivity. So with that, Chris, next slide, please. So when we saw consensus across the charrettes that we've conducted to date, specifically a 2/3 majority consensus across those 19 tables, we actually started working with TBARTA staff and sort of outlining what we think are kind of the base amenities for the project as a whole. And we've kind of settled on at this point is, looking at the requirements of such as accessibility for all, off-board fare collection, maybe an option, either a full canopy or a partial enclosure, depending upon the station location. Those solar panels, we included that. Branding, making sure that we've got a signature style that really kind of communicates to the traveling public that this is something different. This is a premium service and something that they're not necessarily accustomed to. We included the technology, as we discussed, the drop-off pickup areas for Uber and rideshare, those pedestrian improvements and bike racks and restrooms at key locations, either at the intermodal centers or specifically to serve drivers. Next slide, Chris. So the areas where we're going to look to customize the station design based on the feedback we're getting from the public, as you would imagine, parking. So we really want to be very cognizant of the needs that each neighborhood has, and the conversations that we've been having is that in those urban neighborhoods, the need for parking really isn't as strong as maybe in some of the suburban areas, whereas people have the opportunity to walk or bike or use local transit to make that transfer. So that will be a station by station sort of decision and exercise. Public art, had a lot of great conversation about public art. We hope that we can actually work in cooperations with the neighborhoods to have unique public art installations at each one of these stations to sort of signify the uniqueness of that neighborhood and serve the context of that neighborhood. We also had some really great conversations about complete streets, and recognized based on some of our stakeholder comments that we have a really good opportunity to work jointly with the local jurisdictions who already have complete streets programs in place, and maybe leverage that so that we can really look to expand some improvements for bike and ped, not just at the station area, but several blocks out from the station area to ensure that good connectivity, and where appropriate, looking for scooter and bike share rental facilities at these individual station areas. So that's where we're at so far. Like I said, we're working on alignment. We're working on some of those station design concepts. We'll bring you back some information in May as far as those alternatives that we've been discussing and the performance and cost of those alternatives. And then we'll continue working on this station design concept even through the majority of the next several months into the summer. And like I said, we want to keep our opportunities for public engagement open. We're going to have those virtual charrettes live, hopefully very soon. We're working very hard to get that active as soon as possible. And then when we can, continue public outreach, especially in relationship to getting some good input on those station areas. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Scott. Questions for Scott?
This is Commissioner Kemp. I have a question.
Yes.
I have several, actually. So I just wanted to get an update here because it looked like you had significantly reduced the parking. What is the total number of parking spaces that you're looking at now?
I don't have an exact number for you because we're still in the process of doing that design, but it is definitely less than what we were kind of as that sort of placeholder that we had during the prior planning phase. And like you said, we've discussed this in the past, Commissioner, a lot of it is coming down to making sure that we're serving the neighborhoods properly.
So you had 9,000 before. You have no idea maybe what that is going. You had 9,000 parking spaces when you first presented this, and you don't have any idea of what you might reduce it to?
It's an ongoing exercise as we work through the design concept. So
okay.
I can try to give you a sort of an order of magnitude at the May board meeting, but it's certainly coming down from the placeholder we had previously.
Because yeah, and I appreciate that. That I mean, it was predominantly the parking garage plan in the past, and I'd like to know how much it's moved from that. And I have very strongly felt, as you know, that we really don't need any more parking garages in Hillsborough County. So if parking garages were put in other places, the local jurisdiction there would have to match the costs for the parking garages.
We're still looking to figure out exactly how the funding for the project will be. And again, that's, we still have a lot of work to do on this project over the next year. So those will be ongoing conversations.
And even with the changes, I just think for the record, I need to put in there that I really think that it is, that we should never be focused on an interstate system for a transit system as a central part of a transit system. The interstate has not been the central part of any transit systems across the country through a local urban area. There's just no such example of that. And there's a real good reason for that. Across the country, people don't go to stops in other places where they've had choices about stops that are in the interstate, because when you have to walk from your neighborhood to the interstate, it's a very inhospitable, bad walk, and not one that you really want to take to catch transit. And 80% of people walk to their transit. Also, when you're taking transit, if you took it on one side of the interstate, let's say going south on 275, then you'd have to walk underneath the interstate to the other side to take it north back. So it's always going to require that. And it in itself is I just think not a place to be putting any kind of significant in transit investment. I just don't want to see dollars that are so desperately needed for things like our operations, our buses, our electric buses, our service that is so critical to people at the local level on our arterial streets and local streets. I would not want to see that investment not being there. And so I'm, as you know, just do not think that this is a appropriate focus for a transit system. I think we need to focus on our arterials. We need to focus on our local streets. And while this might be good for a commuter system to connect one long region to another, from downtown to downtown, Wesley Chapel to USF, and then to downtown Tampa to the airport, I don't think it's anything to make more with more stations, more stops, or to try to make a central part of our transit system.
Thank you, Pat. Other questions? Scott, I did have one myself. I commend you on putting in the the bike share and the scooter stations there at the stations. I wanted to ask too, have you proactively looked at any ongoing potential partnerships with Uber and Lyft and other rideshare companies to have encouragement of AV technology and transportation on demand services at the various stations as well?
That's an excellent point, Mr. Chairman. We haven't at this date. We're kind of working on those, conceptual design elements. So duly noted, we'll continue to investigate that.
Yeah, I think as time goes on, you'll have more and more on-demand, transportation services. So I think that has to be integrated, future looking into the design of this for special Uber and Lyft drop-offs or any kind of automated vehicle drop-offs. So.
Agreed. And it's interesting, even over the past couple of months, our sort of a sense of how we develop the operating plan for this particular project is evolving as we are seeing our world evolve. We're really thinking less about this project as one route that starts in St. Pete and ends in Wesley Chapel. We're actually looking at sort of a braided route operations that could, penetrate into the neighborhoods and provide more customized, almost like a mobility on demand type of service, where we know the sort of key destinations and attractions are. And so we're trying to evolve with the times and looking at that as part of this project.
Right, and just one other further comment too, I think in following up on what Commissioner Kemp said, I think that as a policy, we need to, even if it's not required by local code, to de-emphasize the size of the parking and encourage folks to take alternate means, whether it be bike, walking, autonomous vehicle, whatever, to get to the stations as opposed to driving a car. We have to be proactive in that and not just reactive to local standards and so forth in that calculus.
Agreed. We've heard that from the board. We've heard that from the public now. And then, of course, there's a secondary benefit that our reduction in parking needs also helps with the capital costs.
Correct. Other questions for Scott?
I have a question. I don't see that. I see Catherine Starkey has her mic off or her mute, but should I ask a question?
Is Catherine, Catherine, we can't hear you. Is your mute on?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Okay, yeah, I think you were recognized first.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we recognize you first and then Commissioner Kemp.
And I have to leave. I have a virtual town hall in just a little bit, so I have to head to my office. But I just want to say that I am fully in support of a solution that gets us to a regional transit opportunity. We are the largest MSA in the country without a solution. And it just is frustrating to hear people trying to stop that. And so I am, whatever baby step we're going to take, we got to take it. But to continue to be the largest area in the country without a solution is not acceptable for me and a lot of my constituents. So thank you. And I have like 2 minutes, then I have to go.
Thank you and concur with that. Commissioner Kemp.
Yes, I just had one more question. with regards to this study, recently I'd seen a report on coronavirus being one of the factors in it that they're looking at is the fact that it seems to be affecting people much worse in the areas with bad air pollution. The air pollution that comes primarily from cars and from highways, particulate matter and noxious gases, and that has already, I've seen some watershed studies that have shown that it has a strong relationship to asthma, childhood asthma, cardiopulmonary disease, cancer, and maybe even dementia at this point. And they're looking very closely, and perhaps coronavirus. I've always been very cautious about attracting people into that air. And, you know, they've talked about that perhaps even reaching out to a mile from interstates, and not so bad in arterial and other smaller places where there's not as many cars. Has that been looked at all with regards to this study?
So I can respond to that. As we move through the summer, after we get through the May board meeting and we sort of settle on some options that you want to carry forward, we're going to begin our environmental analysis throughout the summer. So I can get some more of the air quality information that you're requesting, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Scott, for that.
Commissioner Seal, I believe, is asking for attention.
Sharon?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I was curious how, again, with COVID-19 and the possible effects on mass transit and buses and so on, I know that we have a separate study that'll be looking at different technologies, but it might be that, and I know that we need to marry that technology study together with this, but there may even be redesigns of buses where they could even be like little individual pod areas, or who knows what it might create. So I hope that Scott, that you're kind of looking at that at the present time, because this may change totally how we operate a bus system, or it may cause us to look at other technologies to put in this particular route. Thank you.
No, thank you, Commissioner. That's an excellent comment. After the May board meeting, one of the next items we're going to be starting to tackle and bring to the board is a conversation about the vehicle, which fits in very well with your comment.
Thank you, Scott. Any other questions? Okay, none being heard, we'll turn finally to old and new business. And Cliff, you're recognized for your comments. And again, my apologies for not doing that earlier.
No problem. I appreciate the recognition. I previously had gone over our legislative committee report, and in that report, I recognized Ron, and he provided us an excellent update. I also meant to recognize Steve Palmer, who I see is still hanging on the line, because we also got a great update on the federal legislative activities that we were involved in. And I thought if you wanted to recognize him for the input he had provided, it would be appropriate to do so.
Oh, absolutely. And again, my apologies for taking this in an untimely fashion, but a good one to wrap up with. So yes, you're recognized, Steve.
Mr. Chairman and members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I know the meeting's running along, so I'll be very brief. I think the general manager covered the CARES Act and the money that came to TBARTA in the region through the CARES Act, the $25 billion that came for transit. I think, let me just talk briefly about where we think things are heading in Congress right now. Congress is expected to return into legislative session on May 4th, so a week from next Monday. That date may change, but the attention is already focused on what the next piece of legislation, the COVID response legislation, could look like. It is, the battle lines are really being drawn right now over state and local funding, and I think you're all very well aware of that. The Senate Majority Leader focused on the idea of bankruptcy as opposed to federal funding. That is really where the first, I think, effort will be to add additional money to that and for food assistance. Infrastructure and funding for additional funding for transit is possible, and it's going to be discussed very aggressively by Transportation Committee Chairman Peter DeFazio, whether it be in the COVID response bill or in the reauthorization legislation for the surface transportation bill. There are going to be opportunities this summer and fall for TBARTA and for transit to try to secure additional money. As Chairman DeFazio said, he wants to have a green bill, one where there's more emphasis on transit rather than just highways. So we're working with the general manager. We're working regionally, trying to make sure that there's support in the delegation for transit funding. But I think there are going to be several opportunities for us to explore ways in which we can grow overall pots of money for the coming months and years.
Wonderful, good news to hear, and keep us posted, regularly as we go forward with this.
Absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Any questions for Steve? Okay, thank you for that report.
Thank you, sir.
Any other old or new business to come before the board?
Chair, just one final comment. As a reminder to everybody, the May board meeting is presently scheduled in Hernando County. I know we're doing our meeting today via Zoom, and there's a chance that we will do the May board meeting via Zoom as well. However, we're also at the same time anticipating a potential need for some sort of a hybrid meeting where, again, some people may in fact need to be present. So we're going to work with Hernando, find out what their capabilities are for having a partial Zoom meeting, partial physical presence, and the ability to stream. So we may need to identify some alternate location if in fact we're unable to do a total virtual meeting.
Okay, thank you. Anything else?
This is Commissioner Starkey.
Yes.
Did we decide on a June date?
I think staff was going to poll everyone and look on that without a determination yet as to a specific date. Am I correct, David?
That's my understanding.
Okay, and do we have the same publishing requirements for a public meeting that we have at the county? Do you have to publish in the Times?
Yes, we have to publish in a printed newspaper
Okay.
7 days in advance.
Okay, so if you know that they've gone to twice a week printing, it has really changed our world for public hearings, and you've got to really be way out in front of it. So just a reminder on that.
Thanks. Anything else? Okay, great meeting, everyone. Thanks again for participating and taking time out. Nothing else to talk about. I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Meeting adjourned. Thanks,
Cheers,
everyone.
Starkey.